Hello, and welcome to this edition of Represent NYC on the Manhattan Neighborhood Network. My name is Eric Friedman. I'm the Assistant Executive Director for Public Affairs at the New York City Campaign Finance Board. We are the nonpartisan, independent city agency that empowers New Yorkers to make a greater impact on their elections. We run a citywide voter education campaign through our NYC Votes initiative. We sponsor debates between the candidates for citywide office. We publish the voter guide that is coming to your mailbox. You can also view it online at voting.nyc. That guide has written profiles provided by each candidate running for city office, along with short video statements that are posted online. Again, that's voting.nyc. It's really great to be back here with you as we get ready for another election day here in New York City. It's a great moment to reflect on the special and unique system we have for running elections here in New York City. Over the past few years, New York has really transformed itself from one of the least voter-friendly states in the country to a real laboratory of democracy. We've experienced some big changes over the past few years that have represented great strides towards better access and equity in our elections. New York has adopted early voting. We've introduced ranked choice voting in city elections. New York has automatic voter registration coming in the next few years. And in this election, voters have the opportunity to approve a change to the state constitution that will allow for same-day registration and no excuse absentee voting. All that's very exciting, but one constant through all of these changes is the matching funds program we have for city elections. For over 30 years, the past 9 mayoral elections and for countless elections for city council in between, candidates seeking office have had the opportunity to qualify for public matching funds from the city. Show a basic level of support, and the city will match small contributions from city residents. Those matching funds help ensure that New Yorkers seeking the opportunity to serve don't have to rely solely on large contributions from wealthy interests if they want to run for office. Matching funds help small dollar contributions make a big impact. It means the candidates who participate in the program spend more of their time listening to everyday New Yorkers and less time hearing from lobbyists and special interest bigwigs. The matching funds program has itself undergone some dramatic changes for this election. If you remember our discussion from before the primary, you'll recall that the matching factor for small dollar contributions was increased for this election to $8 for every single dollar raised from New York City resident up to a certain cap, and it makes those small donations more valuable. The overall amount of funds available to candidates was increased so that candidates can rely almost exclusively on small dollar contributions and public matching funds from the city. And the limit on private contributions was cut by more than half. The largest contribution to a mayoral candidate went from over $5,000 down to $2,000 for this election, helping ensure those small dollar contributors continue to have a significant voice. What happened as a result? In the primary, we saw the largest field of candidates ever in a city election. We had a mayoral field of 8 serious candidates, a diverse field that saw historic representation from women, from candidates of color. And the matching fund system played a larger role than ever before. Just this week, the board released the final payments to candidates in the general election coming up on Tuesday. So to help sort through all of this and more, I want to welcome my guest for this edition of Represent NYC. She is Alyssa Katz. Alyssa is a deputy editor with The City, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan digital news platform dedicated to hard-hitting reporting that serves the people of New York City. You can find it online at thecity.nyc. Alyssa is a former member of the New York Daily News editorial board. She was also editor of the New York World and City Limits. She's done some great in-depth reporting on the impact money has had on the way we conduct our politics here on New York City and across the country. And I'm really pleased to have her here on the show.
Thank you for having me.
So Alyssa, let's get into it. One of the aims of public financing is expanding the opportunity for more people to run for office. The city has done some reporting on exactly how that worked in the primary elections, showing that female candidates were really able to benefit from the program. Coming into this year's election, women only represented 14 out of 51 districts in the council. Now going into the general election next week, we're likely looking at a female majority when the new council is seated in January. So the city's reporting showed that female candidates received a greater share of public matching funds than their male counterparts. Is that right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I should say we were able to do that reporting, of course, because the Campaign Finance Board not only facilitates the payment of funds, but has really excellent interactive databases that are very easy to search, download, and our data team at the city really was able to dig into that data and really show the pattern. And the board is also really helpful when we have questions. And your team, Eric, has always been incredibly helpful. So the answer is yes. With your support, we were able to determine this. And what we really heard from the women as well was that they people have to make a real decision when they decide to even run for election, get into politics, about like, can I do this? Does this make sense? Am I going to have to just spend all my time making calls or making calls to donors who might want things from me, or compete against people who are arming themselves with that kind of big money? And I do think it's not only did we see that the women had raised more money than the men, and as you said, also got won seats that they hadn't had. Women had been really underrepresented in the council, and now are getting possibly, depending on how the election turns out, or getting to some kind of parity in the council. But it starts with even the decision to run in the first place. Is this for me? And I think that was really one kind of crucial aspect of this story. And also, I think I'm doing your work for you, Eric, in promoting what the board does. But my understanding is as well that the board really trains candidates in, both in compliance, which is important, because, one thing that the city, my organization also does is a lot of watchdogging about abuses of the system. And I do want to talk about that. It's not all happiness and roses, right? But the training that the CFB is doing for candidates both helps make sure that you know exactly how to document your spending so that you're not getting in trouble and paying fines that you shouldn't have to pay. But also really just about, like, it's kind of candidate school, right? How do I do this? How do I raise money? Like, what's going on, right? So I think all of that is so important. And to just contrast this as well with, another story that my organization had posted more recently, as we're heading into the state elections, right? We have an election for governor, all the usual legislative seats, and it's really night and day between the state system and city system, right? Where the city system is, as Eric described, with this $2,000 limit, other restrictions on maximum donations, and this generous matching funds program. And meanwhile, for the election, for the state elections, an individual donor can give tens of thousands of dollars, and I mean, I could go on and on. There's a lot. There are some restrictions, but it's really the Wild West. And there are plans afoot. I think it's in law now that the state too will start a matching funds program, and that's because of the proof of concept, right? That the city has been doing it so successfully for so long. But for the time being, we're really looking at again, really night and day, and the city system really stands out for the diversity of candidates, diversity of backgrounds, diversity of gender, race. Everything that we've been talking about really comes to the fore.
Yeah, I would love to talk a bit about those contrasts, right, between what we're seeing in the city here, what we've experienced in this election for mayor in 2021. As you mentioned, the city has done some great reporting on how that race for governor next year is shaping up. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about some of those contrasts and really how it plays out in the sort of representation we get out of these elections at the city level versus the results we see in these state elections up in Albany.
Yeah, no, I mean, in state elections, money really talks. And this is despite reforms that we already had seen that had closed off the worst of the state abuses. It was until you started having the two legislative leaders prosecuted for corruption. And before you had people close to Governor Cuomo also prosecuted and guilty of corruption and connection, all of them in connection with campaign donations in some way. You had, companies could just give really anonymously, right? You would have these shell companies that donors, especially in the real estate industry, would have, and they could just basically buy candidates and give millions of dollars without any oversight. And good government reformers had highlighted this for years and said this is screwed up, and it means that Albany is for sale, and what the hell are you doing? And yet, of course, the legislature did not want to change the laws and bite the hand that feeds it. And so nothing changed until just scandal after scandal. Really, Cuomo ultimately had to agree to shut off the tap. But nonetheless, these companies I think it's an important distinction, and Eric, correct me on any nuance I'm getting wrong here, but it's still the case that what's known as a limited liability corporation can give at the state level. And the rules are complicated, but basically they treat it like a person, and they apportion the donations to a person up to the limit, which is currently, since there's no matching funds program, is like $69,000 for a whole election cycle. But the companies can still donate as long as they disclose who's behind them. Whereas I believe in the city system, and LLC you can't just do LLC donations at all, right? Am I right about that?
That's right. Yes.
Yeah. And so, there's some limited circuits, some organizations and unions in a limited way, it can give, but basically the city campaign finance system is really structured around individuals and accountability. Like, here's a name, here's how much they gave. And the matching fund program only applies for city residents and only if they aren't doing business with the city. And, so there's a lot of kind of oversight from the board of kind of who's giving. Whereas at the state, it's still, even despite these reforms, it's still very opaque. And still you have this big role for businesses. But I think that's the really crucial feature, right? There've been some reforms, but you still have a lot of kind of big it's business giving. Certainly labor unions are playing a big role at both the state and city level. And then also a huge thing that we've written about at the state level, which I don't think the city system really allows for much influence, is that you have these committees, like county committees, housekeeping committees, all kinds of committees, where under state laws, they can take money more than $100,000 at a time and then kind of move that money around to different candidates and campaigns pretty readily. And as we wrote about as well, Mayor de Blasio actually got in he almost got in trouble for it. He got investigated and ultimately no criminal charges were brought. But the Manhattan District Attorney had highlighted that he said that de Blasio had violated the spirit of these campaign finance laws, because what he was doing was he wanted to influence specific state Senate elections and wanted to bring in a large volume of money at once, and kind of like hijacked county committees as funnels to get money to specific candidates. And so I guess my point with that is to say that the state law is full of loopholes that everyone in politics knows and exploits, and that are basically legal, right? And that's de Blasio knew that going in, and none of that has changed. In city system, you can't do any of that.
All that is great. And so I'll say that one of the real challenges that I found in this work, like there is, I think, a group of us, who follow politics really, really closely, intensely, and who care very much about the way candidates raise money, and use it as a signifier to kind of help us figure out what these folks are all about. I think the challenge that I find, that I think that you've done a really good job with the city and elsewhere, is kind of helping explain the link between that behavior and how government works and how government shows up in people's lives. One of the reasons I was excited to talk to Alyssa, in addition to work with the city, she's written a really great book-length investigation to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. It's called The Influence Machine. I recommend you go find it. But it tells a really compelling story about how big business exercises political power at the national level, which is largely, though not exclusively, through political spending. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how, in your view, the matching funds program we have here in the city can help provide protections for voters, for regular New Yorkers, against big money interests, setting the agenda and impacting the way that government shows up.
Right. No, I mean, it's very inherent in the program. I mean, I think there's sort of two Achilles heels that, look, we have, as I wrote about in my book, a large body of law in this country, and really via some key Supreme Court decisions, it ultimately says that spending in politics is protected speech under the First Amendment, and there's a lot of constraints on how we can regulate it. And the Campaign Finance Board in New York City has kind of done everything you possibly can, in many ways up to what the law will allow. But the two exceptions, I'll say those in order to sort of highlight where the protections are. I mean, one big exception are what are known as independent expenditures, right? And this goes back to the Supreme Court's Citizens United decision in 2010, and Citizens United said that anyone, any interest, any corporation can spend unlimited amounts of money in an election, and that's protected as long as it's not coordinated with a campaign or candidate. So there's that. And New York City has moved, unlike the Federal Election Commission and unlike Congress, the Campaign Finance Board has strong disclosure requirements. Like, you have to know exactly who's behind the expenditure. You can find all of those ads right on the website. And in fact, there were some improvements to the law recently pressed by the City Council, where now even your mailers or your TV ads says literally who is the individual behind that donation. And that's been really great, because for us journalists, like we go to town on that. We had a lot of fun with that during City Council races earlier this year, to be like, hey, look at who's funding this campaign. And it was some interesting stories there, including like the Walmart family and, all kinds of other players. Like, why do they care about a city council election? This woman from Arkansas, but she did because she cared about charter schools. So that's sort of one big loophole. And the other, of course, is that you can't force candidates into the matching funds program. You can sort of hope they will. There's a lot of incentives, but in this mayor's race, in the Democratic primary, for example, we saw Ray McGuire, wealthy banker, said, I'm not going to be in the matching fund system, raise his own money. You still have restrictions on how much you can give your own campaign a lot of money. And that's how Mike Bloomberg, right, powered his own election. But you can't just, even if you're not on the matching funds program, just take unlimited amounts of money. You also have limits on yourself, but they're much higher limits, and you can self-fund. And, there's a whole like Bloomberg loophole there. So the CFB is saying, it's elevating the candidates who are participating in the matching fund program so much that you kind of can't do this kind of arms race of fundraising that kind of sidelines candidates who are not just kind of either rich themselves or pandering to rich people. And it just makes a huge difference. It's very different than in Congress, for example, where you do have candidates who are just members of Congress who are incumbents who that's all they're doing is raising money. That's like, it's not every day, but on a regular basis. I was sort of surprised, we are in 2021, we're in between election years. And, I'm not on the campaign fundraising circuit, but apparently congressional fundraising parties are, happening. And those members of Congress are hobnobbing all the time with people who are donating a lot of money to them. You see it in terms of what they will or won't advocate in Congress.
So with that, you mentioned a few minutes ago independent expenditures and how they play out in city elections. I would love to kind of give the viewers a quick look, if they're interested in doing a little digging on the CFB resources, with our CFB resources, where they can find information and kind of do that sort of reporting that Alyssa was talking about. I'll give a quick look at our website here, nyccfb.info. You can check out our Follow the Money database, and we've got there complete information about some of the outside money that folks are spending on independent expenditures in these races. There were a lot of competitive races in the primary, and coming up in the general election, a couple of really competitive races for city council. And so if you search independent spenders on our website, look at expenditures, you can see images of mailers that are going out to campaigns, showing up in people's mailboxes. You can see some of the TV ads that folks are putting out. Here's an example.
The brave men and women who protect New York City trust and support Sal Albanese. Sal Albanese is the kind of independent fighter we need to stand up to the radicals who want to defund the police, and leave our communities vulnerable.
So that's the example of the kind of thing that you'll be able to find if you go to our website. You'll see all of the ads that were up in the primary as well as the general election. So again, Alyssa, what does information like this tell us about what we can expect from these candidates if and when they get elected to office?
So we have to be very careful with independent expenditures, of course, because, and there's an interesting game that goes on. Because as I said earlier in the show, the Supreme Court said that, companies that interests can spend an unlimited sum, but cannot coordinate with candidates. So that even if a candidate is sympathetic and does want to support the agenda of the PBA, in this case, they can't say, oh yeah, like I'm right there with them, or that they've been talking to them, because that would be illegal and get either them or the advertiser or both in trouble. But obviously, if somebody knows that they have this debt to someone who bought a $155,000 of ads on their behalf in the run up to election day, and they win, I mean, clearly there's going to be some sense of indebtedness there to those interests.
I think was something I wanted to ask, just because I know you've been around a bit and kind of observed a few elections. I mentioned kind of at the top about the way that our program in New York City was enhanced and really kind of built out for this election. From your perspective, do you notice a change in this past 21 set of races when compared with previous elections for mayor here in New York City?
Yeah, absolutely. And one I had been aware of, but it hadn't crystallized for me until my colleague Josefa Velasquez interviewed Zephyr Teachout for this article about state elections. And she said, look, you can see how many grassroots activists are running and winning nomination for city council. And I know many of them from just their years in the trenches and as sources. And, it's just really, and it's also a very diverse group, right? You have folks who are, from working class backgrounds or who've been working in public interest jobs who are able to run and able to get nominated and possibly win in this election. I think that's a huge change. And I do expect we'll continue to see that pattern hold in the future.
So we've been talking a lot about our system we have in New York City, but obviously, we're not the only game out there. What other models are you aware of out in other cities, other states, for folks who are trying to use government resources to help more candidates have a voice in elections?
Okay, I'm going to plead some ignorance here, Eric, because of course I've got some tunnel vision, being a journalist covering New York City. I do think, of course, one of the innovations, which is not about campaign finance, but is something very new in New York City, that we're also reckoning with in some ways, is ranked choice voting, which had really been tested in a lot of different cities, at the local level, and then came into play here. And I think one thing about ranked choice is that its implementation in New York City is very incomplete, in the sense that we had it in the primaries and it clearly played a big role in the primaries, but then we don't have it for the general election, and that's an anomaly. No place else does it that way. And I think that there may have been some concerns around, we still, as much as reform has happened, including the reforms in voting that Eric talked about at the start of the show, we still always kind of default to kind of party protectionism as kind of a baseline for making reforms. And I do think that, we still have a big problem in New York, I think, where, we don't have anything close to nonpartisan elections, which many cities do have, and also this sort of a process that would allow really robust general elections. I should add that the early numbers about the number of people early voting right now for mayor and all these city council races are tiny turnout right now. Somebody was posting this on social media. We were speaking on Wednesday, so these numbers could change, but it's fractions of a percent of voters have turned out so far. And this does not bode well for election day and for the voter participation. For all the money and matching funds that were spent in the primaries and in the general election, we could see very, very low turnout. And that's in part because we really are basically in most districts a Democratic Party town. There are these exceptions where there are competitive races. So even in the quote unquote Republican districts, for many of them, it could go either way. They're kind of purple districts. But because of that, our general elections are kind of not just an anticlimax, they're not even really competitive. And I think that that's, it may feel like a good place to be given the overwhelming Democratic majority of voters in the city. But nonetheless, we have to ask ourselves, is it healthy for any kind of political system to basically have one party rule, which is pretty much what we have, because that can lead to, even if people are right on the policies in the voters' view or right on everything else, it can lead to abuses of power potentially, because there's sort of no one checking that power. So that's, I think, a continued concern.
Yeah, I will stop short of wading into sort of the whole question around should we have nonpartisan elections and should we have ranked choice voting in general. I will just kind of point out one of those things that I think has always been a frustration for me and I know for a lot of us who work in elections in the city. We always have really low turnout for local elections. We're coming off a year where there was intense interest in the presidential race, and turnout in the city is always north of 60%, close to 2/3 of registered voters. Well, we struggle really to hit 25% in these local year mayoral elections, and it's certainly related to some of those issues you were raising for sure. So if you'd like more information about the money that's been raised and spent by candidates in this election, and again, kind of dive a little bit more into the impact that matching funds have had, there's some great online resources we have at nyccfb.info. Not only the ads that are being run by some of these outside groups, but all the names of folks who've given money to the candidates. We've got great interactive maps that help you visualize where the money comes from. And so all of that, again, is available at nyccfb.info. If you are like me and you put off things to the last minute, go vote this weekend. Voting is open. Early voting started last weekend. It is available both Saturday and Sunday, starting at 8 a.m. Election day, Tuesday, November 2nd, polls are open 6 a.m. to 9 p.m. Please, before you vote, go to voting.nyc. There you can find your poll site. You can check out the NYC Votes Voter Guide to learn about the candidates and read up about the 5 questions that'll be on your ballot. Go vote. Make sure to thank your poll workers for keeping our democracy working. Once more, I want to thank my guest, Alyssa Katz from the city, for a really great discussion. I also want to thank you, the viewers, for watching Represent NYC on the Manhattan Neighborhood Network today. Bye-bye.